On January 7th, after his first statement on the day, Trump was prevailed upon to come out and make a statement from the White House condemning the January 6th attack. He condemned it the day after. Now we come to 2025. What we hear from Trump is that nothing wrong was done that day at all. He's characterized the people who earlier he called infiltrators of the Capitol, people who caused violence and mayhem. He's now characterizing them as heroes, glamorizing them, treating them as political prisoners. None of that is true. It's a rewriting of history.
This was a domestic terrorist attack because it was political violence aimed at intimidating people politically, aimed at nudging election results in the future in the direction intended by those perpetrating the violence. It is a dagger at the heart of our constitutional order, which depends upon a strict separation of powers. Those powers cannot function if they are now threatened by intimidation.
On his first day in office, President Donald Trump commuted sentences of 14 people who were convicted of crimes related to the January 6, 2021 attacks on the US Capitol. And he unconditionally pardoned all other individuals, and I'm quoting from the statement, all other individuals convicted of offenses related to the events that occurred at or near the US Capitol on that day. What to make of these pardons? And how to think about the way in which January 6 is now understood in people's minds. Welcome to the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm Elan Journo. I'm joined today by my colleague, Ben Bayer. Ben, I want to start with, what is your take on the attack or the storming of the Capitol that happened on 2021?
More or less, it was an outrageous attack on the Constitution and on American values, and on the lives of police officers and congressmen. And we'll talk more about that today. And I think there's even more to be said about the proper way to conceptualize it. But that is the essence of it. I think it was a massive injustice and a massive evil. And that should already, I think, deliver my estimate of the pardons, which is that they are trying to rewrite reality. I could say it was a miscarriage of justice, but it's not even an attempt at justice. It's an evasion of the massive injustice of January 6th.
So let's talk about there's a lot of controversy about what January 6th even means now. And I think that's an interesting point. You're raising this from the perspective of, you're characterizing this as a rewriting of history. I think that's an important part of the story. So let's start with, is your view then that all the people who've been pardoned, or all the people who are part of this commutation, don't deserve it? How do you think of the different cases that have been swept up into this sweeping of blame?
I mean, yeah, the issue here is it is so sweeping, and I have not studied the hundreds of cases to know all of their details, or to know that everyone who's been accused of a crime is actually guilty or got the sentence that they deserve. That's not the issue here. It's totally conceivable that someone might have gotten swept up in not only the event, but in the prosecutions who shouldn't have been. But the important point is that we know a lot of people who really did commit crimes who are now either having their sentences commuted or being unconditionally pardoned. We know that. And so it's a fine debate to have about how many, but the pardons don't do any of this parsing. So we know, for example, the following sorts of individuals had their sentence commuted. And this is, by the way, this is all public record. This is all in the January 6th report. It's all been uncontested by Trump's own pardon document. So the leader of the Oath Keepers who planned the attack, who created a stash of weapons in case Trump called him to form a militia, who advised his colleagues to hide the knives that they were bringing with them into the Capitol, he's had his sentence commuted. The Proud Boy, who was the first to smash the Senate window and thereby to allow a mob in to the building during the constitutional proceedings using a shield he had stolen from police. He has had his sentence commuted. And then those were individuals mentioned by name as having their sentences commuted. What the part that you quoted from earlier, Elan, was the blanket unconditional pardon to all other individuals convicted of offenses related to the events on this day, which is about as blanket language as you can get. And given who we know was not listed as having their sentence commuted, but we know who was nonetheless involved in this attack, that is going to include people who beat police officers with hockey sticks, people who led the charge up the Capitol steps saying, "Let's take the effing Capitol," who pushed police out of the way to allow the mob in, people who sprayed, a large number of individuals who sprayed police officers with pepper spray, and people who brutally tased and beat and robbed Metropolitan Police Officer Michael Fanone. These are documented cases and there's in most cases video evidence of these people, and they've all been in many cases not just had a sentence commuted that they had already served, but are pardoned, and as though the crime had never occurred and is not warranting of any punishment.
I think it's worth adding that there are cases still that have yet to come before a judge, yet to be prosecuted, that have been completely wiped away. So this is all pending cases as well. So this is you called it a blanket pardon. I think that's really important to thinking about if this is at all taking justice seriously. And I think it is not. It's making a mockery of justice, and we'll say more about that. Ben, I'm interested in your perspective on why would anyone think that these people should be pardoned? What would be the rationale? What's the thinking behind this?
Well, I mean, one important thing is that the thinking is not actually explained anywhere. There's no justification given in the pardon document that the president posted. And he's had very little to say about his rationale when asked questions. We'll come to some of that later. And so I think it's important the way you're framing it as simply wanting to erase the past, as simply wanting to erase important facts. And that's in keeping with the whole mentality of the rioters who participated in the attack in the first place. It is relevant to consider that what propelled this attack in the first place was, of course, denial of the 2020 election results. And this was another attempt to erase important historical facts. And one of the things I want to talk about today, Elan, is the interesting parallels between the style of thinking that was used to deny the election results in the first place, and then the style of thinking that goes into thinking that January 6th didn't matter so much. They're, for the most part, the same style of thinking. And the first topic, the issue of election denial, is something that we've talked about in previous podcasts on this channel. We'll share some of those older podcasts later at the end of the episode. But it's worth revisiting some of the kinds of considerations that led people, supporters of President Trump, and led Trump himself to want to deny the 2020 election results. The first thing to note about it is just the arbitrary baselessness of it. There was a real tendency to be on the lookout for any loose, anomalous, random observation that you looked a little strange, that you could then slant into a narrative that you could concoct into this is a reason to think the election was stolen. My go-to example here is the piece of evidence that was offered by someone like Rudy Giuliani as this was the smoking gun. Those were his words, that this was the most obvious thing you could use to show there was election fraud. And this was that Atlanta State Farm Arena video where there's video of people moving boxes. And a naive person watching this video who didn't know anything about what was going on would have no reason at all to think that this was any kind of election fraud. It's something that you can think only if you're given a narrative, and which is then kind of forced into the mold of an election fraud theory. I mean, you can refute this allegation by looking at all the other video, realizing that the boxes were put there by election workers, just like all the other boxes, that they're not suitcases, that they're standard issue election boxes that had ballots that from the election that were placed into them. This was all debunked, but it was concocted on the basis of nothing. And then even after debunked, Trump repeats it anyway. The other thing to think about how these theories were propagated and processed is as soon as one theory is debunked, another one is offered. And it doesn't even matter that they're inconsistent with each other. It doesn't even matter that they couldn't all be true. So like first, it's the Dominion voting machines that are supposed to have manipulated the votes on mass scale through some kind of computer hack. And when that's shown to be impossible because the Dominion machines aren't actually connected to the internet. No, now it's the smoking gun of the suitcases, which of course you wouldn't need to do if you could do a computer hack, because why bother stuffing ballots through a machine if it can all be done electronically? Or first, it's the late night changes in the numbers where lots of Republican votes are coming in, and then there's suddenly a dump of Democratic votes, which of course everyone expected to happen because Democratic cities are bigger and take longer to count. And when that doesn't end up making sense, change it to the idea of, no, it's actually computer manipulation, even though somebody who was doing computer manipulation would probably try to do it in a way where the numbers looked even and better and looked better first earlier in the evening. So the playing fast and loose with the evidence, not minding the fact that you're delivering a bunch of contradictory theories, it works when there's short attention spans on social media, when no one's actually tracking the narrative or paying attention. Of course, in a setting like a court of law where evidence actually matters, where there's an adversarial system and other lawyers will refute the claims and point out that others are baseless, there these arguments don't work, which is why these cases all lost nearly systematically in courts of law. But that doesn't matter on a medium like social media, especially when it's coming from someone like President Trump, who has no regard for the truth, who doesn't care about it, who spouts whatever comes into his mind at the moment if it serves a certain purpose of his, and who we know early, before the election even happened, said he was going to regard any loss as evidence of rigging. You can't know before an election happens that it was rigged. And we know that his team was telling him that he lost the election. We know there were no basis for his theories, but he advances them anyway in spite of what his team tells him, in spite of the fact that they're losing in the courts. And now the thing to say about the January 6th attack itself, first, is that people who are participating in it are motivated by these kinds of claims, these kinds of baseless, arbitrary claims that are the product of imagination, that are product of manipulation of evidence out of context. They're motivated by those theories. And now the way that many Trump supporters think about the January 6th attacks themselves follows that exact same pattern. It has that same gleeful attempt to slant modest anomalies in favor of a narrative. So, for example, you hear this talking point circulated. Oh, the people, the January 6th protesters were just invited in. Because, in fact, there are a few videos you see protesters walking past police officers once they're inside the Capitol rotunda. Now, why is this an example of just slanting the evidence in favor of a narrative without regard to the wider context of fact? Because these videos were taken well after the Capitol was already breached, at which point the police have fallen back. They're trying just to now protect congressmen. Never mind the fact that there are all kinds of other videos showing the kind of violence that we talked about at the beginning, with Proud Boys and Oath Keepers breaking windows, beating police officers, abundant evidence that there was violence. So again, it's important that the claim here is not that all of the people who are walking through the Capitol are necessarily guilty of something worse than trespassing. The problem is with those violent attackers, and nobody wants to talk about them. Nobody wants to include them in the discussion, yet they're the ones who are now being pardoned. And you see the same kind of shifting inconsistent theories that they move very quickly from no one did anything wrong, they were just being invited in, to, oh, actually it was a false flag attack staged by FBI agents who weren't there actually. They were FBI informants who didn't instigate anything. So it's a stunning war with reality. And to the extent that anyone pretends to offer evidence, it's evidence that's manipulated, it's evidence that's taken out of context. It's not actually evidence is what that means. But it's there to serve the purpose of this narrative, this wishful thinking narrative that an election loss didn't happen, and that outrageous violence didn't happen because of that delusion.
I just want to build on what you're saying, Ben, and offers another angle on it, which is, so you characterized it as wishing for some facts to be true, or taking a narrative and then making things fit that narrative. And I think there's an important, and you also characterize it as a war on reality, war on facts. I think that's a really significant way to think about this. And one of the things I take from Ayn Rand's philosophy is her identification of two fundamental stands you can have towards reality, which the correct one, the one that's really concerned with living and with creating values, is what she calls the primacy of existence, really facing the facts, orienting yourselves to what's true, and recognizing that facts are not for you to change. There's no power in your mind that can change the facts. In contrast with what she characterizes as primacy of consciousness. And there's many, many forms in which we can find that in history of thought. But one very simple way in which it manifests is when people wish something to be true and they rewrite reality to make it so. And they will, in some way you're characterizing, I would classify as, it reflects this kind of stand on life, that your wishes can determine reality. And I think this is part of the explanation for why there is such a desire and a wallowing in the arbitrary claims. And as soon as you knock one down, there's 6 others that follow it. And you can never win that game because they're completely arbitrary, that they're not based in fact. And this issue of your fundamental orientation to reality, I think, is crucial. And there's a lot more to say about this, but I just want to take one thread and talk about how the way in which the attacks of January 6th have been understood or reimagined or rewritten is important, because I think it reflects this primacy of consciousness perspective. And let me give some examples of this. So it's important to go back to the historical record. And you were referring to the Senate committee report, which people can go and find. You can look at videos of Trump's own statements from that day. And I want to remind people of what was actually the case on January 6th and 7th, and what has now been presented to us as the account of what happened. And it's essentially been rewritten. So here are a few of the facts. On January 7th, after his first statement on the day, Trump was prevailed upon to come out and make a statement from the White House condemning the January 6th attack. He condemned it the day after. Now, how much he believed it, I don't know, but these are his own words. What he said was this was a, quote, heinous attack on the Capitol. He said, quote, I am outraged by the violence and mayhem. The demonstrators who infiltrated the Capitol have defiled the seat of American democracy. These are Trump's own words on January 7th. Further, quote, to those who are engaged in acts of violence and destruction, you do not represent our country. To those who broke the law, you will pay, end quote. Now we come to 2025, where you just quote, earlier I quoted from the blanket pardon of upwards of 1,600 cases and people involved in them, none of that is reflected. None of Trump's original view of this or his statement from January 7th is reflected in this. In fact, what we hear from Trump is that nothing wrong was done that day at all. That's a statement he made. I'm paraphrasing it from an interview he did on Univision in 2024. He said, it's a day of love. He's characterized the people who earlier he called infiltrators of the Capitol, people who caused violence and mayhem, people who broke law. He's now characterizing them as heroes, glamorizing them, treating them as political prisoners, characterizing them as martyrs to the American patriotic cause. None of that is true. It's a rewriting of history. Just one other aspect of this, which is it's not only Trump. So it's important to stress that this is not, I don't want this to, the point here is not unique to him, but I think he sets a certain tone. And I think a lot of people are following him, including members of the Republican Party, which is significant because I think this is evidence of his influence over the party, which is just really mind-boggling. So after the attacks, again, it's useful to go back and toggle back to what actually was said. One of the many people who condemned the attacks and who regarded Trump as complicit in them was Mitch McConnell. People might remember him. He's not exactly gone away. So Mitch McConnell said in 2021, Trump is, quote, morally and practically responsible for provoking the events of the day, end quote. Now, you don't hear Republicans talk like that. There are one or two people who are willing to murmur a few things about, well, maybe the violent people should not have been allowed. Maybe I'm not sure I would have agreed with it. Very, very few people. And in fact, what you do get is a deafening silence in reaction to the blanket pardons, which I think is telling because I think there's an ethos now that you cannot go against Trump on what is the current retelling of that day. And think about all the ways in which the people involved in these attacks, the actual nature of what they did those days, the attacking of police officers, the breaking of property, the soiling and defiling of the seat of American government. These people have been lionized as martyrs in songs, and they've been at Trump rallies. There have been songs played by people who regard themselves as the J6 choir. This whole rewriting is an expression of, we want it to be different than what it actually was. We will continue to insist it was different. We will tell a different story than the facts actually warrant. And it will be so. So wishing makes it so. And I think that is a really, really destructive pattern that we're seeing in the way in which January 6th itself, just the attacks themselves, which I regard as a day of infamy for American freedom, and that I think the people involved should be seen as having attempted to terrorize our elected leaders. All of that has been wiped away, both in the retelling of what happened that day, and then even more so, I think what's certifying that rewritten history, what certifies it is this blanket pardon, which is an attempt to wipe away all the facts that are relevant to thinking about what those people did, why they did it, and who incited them to do that.
I mean, the blanket nature of everything is especially concerning. And you mentioned that there were maybe a few politicians here and there who would mumble concern about the violent offenders. Maybe they shouldn't have been pardoned. There was a really revealing moment in a press conference that Trump did just in the last day, where he's asked about this. The reporter says, the reporter describes some of the violent individuals we mentioned at the top of the program and asks Trump directly, should he have been pardoned? And Trump's response was telling. He says, well, are you sure you're not talking about one of the people who was commuted? Implication being, well, he was already punished somewhat. And the reporter says, no, this is someone who you simply pardoned. And Trump says, well, we'll have to look at that, first of all. You'd think that they would have looked at that before doing the pardon. Apparently, he didn't. He doesn't know anything about these individuals or want to acknowledge anything about them. But then he says, well, what about all the people, all the actual murderers who are pardoned? which is a dodge, which is changing the subject, which is itself a form of evasion. Because, of course, well, yeah, it's totally possible there are other people pardoned by other leaders who shouldn't be pardoned. Does this excuse you're doing the wrong thing, Mr. President? No, it doesn't excuse it. Is it possible you're both wrong? Is there a reason there's a difference between it? Don't want to answer any of these questions. That's the evasion in action.
I want to bring up another aspect that is implied in what you've already said and some of the comments we set up the conversation with, which is that part of what's important to think about is what is the nature of this pardon, what is the nature of the consequences that will follow. And I remember you and I and our colleague Ankar Gade had a discussion soon after the first assassination attempt against Trump last summer. I remember it vividly. And one of the issues we talked about at that time was the climate in America, the growing climate of the normalization of political violence. And with the assassination as very likely an expression of that. There wasn't enough known, but I think it was plausible to see it as that. It was part of that climate. And at the time, one thing that I remember, part of the discussion, but also from reading around the issue, was a view that many people who are supportive of Trump, people in the conservative movement, people in the Republican Party, one of the things that they were saying about the assassination very quickly, and I don't know that they have all the evidence for it, but there was plausibility to it, was that look at the liberals, look at the Democrats, look what they're doing to create rhetoric that prepares the ground for an assassination, that normalizes political violence, that is putting a target on Trump. And there's something to that. I think the normalization of political violence is not restricted to any particular part of the political landscape. And I think that needs to be called out and that needs to be criticized and denounced for sure. I think you can't say those things about what was done at the time after Trump was the first attempt at assassinating him, decrying political violence and the rhetoric that is fomenting it, and then endorse this blanket pardon. Because what could be a greater incentive, a greater normalization of political violence than this indiscriminate blanket pardon and commutation for people who engaged in what was one of the worst attacks on American government domestically in living memory, if not history, and that in effect it glorifies those people. It isn't simply that they're let off; that their slate is wiped clean. And if you think about what encourages people to engage in political violence, is they can see themselves as either getting away with it or being absolved of something if they are caught. And I think this sets a really worrying precedent. And this isn't simply a point about, this would be bad if it were done in the other direction. If there were people involved in the Black Lives Matter protests and riots and the looting and the firebombing and all those things, if they were treated the same way, that would also be an outrage. So it's not simply that it's what these people did, but it's if you're thinking about the growing risk and climate that makes political violence a feature of our society, you have to be outraged about this particular action, because this really is a powerful, it's like rocket fuel. This is going to incentivize many more and probably worse things to come.
I think it's a really important point, especially because of the fact that the January 6th attack was precisely an assassination attempt. There were many people in the crowd who wanted to hang Mike Pence. They built the gallows for him, and it wasn't just a stunt. It wasn't just a prop. It was there were her message indicating that this was their intent, and they had been propelled this way by Trump's claims about what Pence should do to overturn these election results. And I mean, at the very least, the violence directed against the entire House of Representatives was on equal footing. Didn't come as close to killing any of them as the shooter did, but the intent and the threat was definitely there. And all of this is now being rewarded. And I think you're right, Elan. It's there's more to be said, and we will say more about the effect that this kind of injection of force into the political system will have on our political culture. but another aspect of what you've raised there is what looks like a double standard about what's tolerable versus what must be condemned. Condemned the attempt on the life of the president, not January 6th. And I think this speaks to another trend in our culture that this is a manifestation of, which is tribalism, which is the loyalty to one's own group rather than to any kind of principle or concern for the truth. And you always see double standards when there's tribalism in play, because you don't actually care about the principle that there should be no political violence, that there should be rule of law. What you care about is whatever is good for your tribe goes. It's the other tribe that's supposed to be limited and restrained. And you see this in all kinds of aspects of the January 6th controversy. The most obvious is that the Trump supporters who are now trying to make apologies for January 6th ordinarily claim to be on the side of law and order and the rule of law. And this is why they care about immigrants coming into the country and why they care about crime in American cities. And they're the ones who bemoaned the Black Lives Matter protest. And on many of these cases, rightly so, because there really was chaos in the streets in the summer of 2020, and Black Lives Matter riots were completely out of control and should have been suppressed. And they would be consistent if they took the same line against BLM as they take against January 6th. But of course they don't, because in this case, it's their own tribe that's doing the rioting, and they don't care, in this case, about the thin blue line, about police. They don't even care about the police when it's the police who are defending the operation of the basic law of the land, the Constitution, and constitutional procedures for peaceful transition of power. Another case related to that you see the same kind of tribalistic double standard coming out is the way certain of the commentators think about the way that January 6th protesters behaved. Among those who can't quite bring themselves to say that it was an inside job or that actually the protesters didn't do anything wrong, there are those like the author Julie Kelly, who wrote a book on the subject, who argue, well, yeah, they did some violent things, but they were provoked by the Capitol Police as they marched up the west steps of the Capitol and threatened to break in, and were in a area that it was unlawful for them to be in, which had been fenced off. They'd been told to disperse. And yes, it's true that the police used tear gas to try to disperse them. But the idea, we've been attacked by the tear gas of the police, and therefore our reaction isn't up to us. It's not our fault. We're just fighting for self-defense. That's the exact same kind of claim that these people would never accept if it were coming from left-wing Black Lives Matter protesters who were using it to explain why they rioted after they had unlawfully occupied property, or pro-Hamas demonstrators who unlawfully occupy university campuses. They have the right to remove you if you're there unlawfully, and the fact that you now double down on your violence is not more excusable because of that. She wouldn't allow the same excuse for leftists, but she's happy again to use it for members of her own tribe. And the last example of this kind of tribalistic double standard is again, this has come up once already with regard to pardons. And so there are people who will say, what about Biden's pardons? He pardoned his son. He pardoned Leonard Peltier, who killed FBI agents in the 1970s. Oblivious to the possibility that you could think that all these pardons are bad, that Biden's pardons may have been bad, and Trump's pardons bad too, possibly worse. But of course, that's that same dodge that the president used in response to the reporter's question. If the other side's doing it, I don't have to talk about why it's okay for my side to do it. Really, what's operating behind the scenes is the principle is something I'm only going to use to bludgeon the other side. I'm not going to ever think about it critically with regard to my side, because principles and truth don't matter here, because it's only about tribal loyalty, which at the end, I think, reduces to I hate the other side. I'll do anything to feel safe with my side.
Yeah, and I think this integrates with the concern about growing political violence, because I think if part of what tribalism is, as you were characterizing it, is this obliviousness to facts and not a concern with actual principles, and which manifests in double standards often. And I think the way to think about this descent into tribalism is that arguments and facts and persuasion are no longer concerns of the people involved. They're not really interested in convincing anybody. And they also likely don't think they can convince anybody, because often their own views are not held as a result of conviction and persuasion and evidence. They're held for other reasons. They're held for loyalty reasons, for authority. And when one's own views are held that way, it's not surprising if you don't think other people need to be convinced, or even that you don't think the other side is human enough to have a mind such that you need to persuade them, or they can be persuaded. So it really changes your perspective on what human nature is and what you're capable of doing and how you can relate to other human beings. And that the whole possibility of human communication depends on the belief that other people have a rational mind, that they're capable of thinking, they're capable of being persuaded. And if that goes out of the window, the more you move towards a tribal way of thinking. And I think this is what we're seeing is definitely heading in that direction. I just wanted to add one thing. I know this isn't, I don't really want to get into this in depth, but I just want to flag this one issue as a sidebar, which is the issue of pardons as something that the president can do. And of course, it's in the Constitution. So my point here is not this is dreamed up and it's unique to one president or another. I think at some point it'd be useful to think about how well does this really integrate with the other principles that define the Constitution? Because my read of this is that the power to pardon, if it's legitimate, and I'm not convinced it is, and this is one further piece of evidence of why it could really be a problem to have it, is that it's much more a feature of what you would expect from a government run by a monarch or a dictator, where you can override the rule of law. Now, I can see arguments for having this power, because I can think of ways in which the judicial system can go wrong, and you would need to override it, and there'd be a way to push to get better laws. So there's an argument that I can see, and I think the founders had arguments for why they included this. But I just want to highlight that it's not obviously a good thing. And if you were going to, and I think the other aspect of this is if there is this power, then I think it's important to judge those who use it and to evaluate what criteria are they using when they use this power, because it's such an awesome power. If it's become something cheapened by, well, you are a friend of mine, or a friend of mine and a friend of mine asked me to pardon you and I will do that, and it becomes something that is subject to pull peddling, which it has become, and it's not unique to Trump or to Biden. This is a long-standing problem. The more it becomes subject to abuse, the more you have to view it as, this is too awesome a power. It has to be rare, exceptional, and you would have to think what principles would guide you in using this kind of power. So I just wanted to flag that, because I think it's natural to see it. It's part of the Constitution, and one has to take it as it's within the scope of the presidency. But I think one has to question aspects of the Constitution that don't really integrate, or at least there's question about how you would make sure that this doesn't become subject to abuse, which I think it has become, for sure.
Yeah, I think certainly worth thinking about why that power is part of the Constitution, if it should be there at all. And I think if it should be, at the very least, you have to make the distinction between the proper use of the power and the abuse of the power. And, John Adams thought that the Constitution was only as good as the virtue of the leaders who were there to exercise it. And you can have the best Constitution in the world, and if you have vicious leaders who, for whatever reason, manage to work their way into the system, the Constitution will not last. It will not be able to sustain freedom, and that, I think, is a good opportunity to segue into our final topic, which is the way in which January 6th and now this pardoning of January 6th participants, particularly this blanket pardoning of January 6th participants, I think is really at odds with the Constitution and and more broadly the constitutional order. And there's all kinds of ways this is true. Trump may have it in his constitutional power to pardon these people, but Trump has been in gross dereliction of his constitutional duties, and the way in which he has been, I think, is going to undermine the Constitution. That is to say, the way the nation's constituted, its proper functioning in the long run. This is especially clear just from his simple dereliction of duty on the day of January 6th. He's the president. He's supposed to be the executor of the law. That's his constitutional duty. And on that day, leave aside all questions of whether he was actually responsible for inciting the crowd. I think you can make a pretty good case, if ever you could, that he did. But bracket that for the moment. At the very least, you would argue, surely he had the duty to enforce the law, which was the Constitution, which was the procedure that was happening at that time on Capitol Hill, to protect Congress from this riotous mob. He and he alone had exclusive authority to order the District of Columbia National Guard to stop this attack. He never did so. Yeah, there's evasions that Trump supporters will give about how Nancy Pelosi was offered troops. That was with regard to his parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. It remains the case that he never was in touch with any national security officials that entire day, asking them to call out the troops. He waited 187 minutes between learning of the attack on Capitol Hill and asking his supporters to go home. In the meantime, after learning about what was happening there, before telling them to go home, he tweeted that Mike Pence didn't have the courage to change the results, knowing that they were already masked with their aims on Mike Pence. When they get this tweet, the crowd surges. This is a clear dereliction of his constitutional duty, and that should have been sufficient grounds, in my opinion, to impeach him. It didn't happen. But there's more to say about just the overall results of the effect of something like this on the judiciary, the effect on the Constitution, in particular the judiciary that had made these decisions about the elections. And I mean, what do you think about that, Elan?
Yeah, I have a grave concern about the future of rule of law in this country. And I think this incident, the blanket pardons that we've been talking about, are really ominous for where we're heading. And I raise this because part of the narrative that you hear, and this you can see this from J.D. Vance, the vice president, and many other people, is that many of the people got garbage trials. So it's not a question of were they guilty or not. The trials weren't any good. And there's an impugning of particular judges. Now, I find it very hard to believe that out of, 1,600 individual cases plus, and there's others pending, and whatever the exact number is, let's say it's 1,000 rounding up, and every single one of those was a garbage trial. Every single one of them was a miscarriage of justice. Really, I watched the footage that the Senate committee watched. There's just such a mountain of evidence against so many of these people. It's very hard to believe that every single case was a miscarriage and that these people should have been let off. That is just, it's hard to. Now, if you're going to make a claim that the judiciary has been, in some sense, systematically prejudicial to all these people, that is such a strong claim. All kinds of different courts, all kinds of judges, every single one of them was prejudiced against these people, including judges appointed by Ronald Reagan and other Republicans. They're all prejudiced against these people. That is such an extraordinary claim that it would require a mountain of evidence for every single claim that you make about every single case and I don't think you could do that. I don't think it's credible. I don't think there's even an attempt to do that. And this is part of what's worrisome. J.D. Vance I think he got a law degree, so he knows what would be involved in justifying this kind of claim. You don't get any of that. And I think part of why I see this as a worrying sign about rule of law is that this, both the pardon but also the narrative leading up to it, is it's impugning the judiciary as a whole. It's undermining the integrity and the independence of the judiciary. And of the branches of government, I think it's a really good branch. It's much healthier than Congress. It's much healthier than the president. In some ways, maybe it should be stronger. Maybe it needs more independence. There's things you could say about what the future of the judiciary should be, but this is an undermining of it. And it's sowing. And then the deeper perspective on this, or the wider perspective on this, is that it's sowing distrust in a vital institution. It's not optional whether you have a judiciary. It's not optional. It's essential to the future of freedom in this country that we have an independent rule of law judiciary. And this kind of case and the kind of discussion around the January 6th perpetrators and how they've been handled, I think it's really an attack on this whole institution and institutions as such. And this is not unique to January 6th. There's a whole perspective that their institutions are bad and they need to be gutted and emptied out. I don't think that is warranted. And I think this is part of the evidence for why there's significant concern for the future of rule of law in this country.
Yeah, it's rule of law and elections conducted according to rules that are adjudicated by judges, or it's violence. There really isn't any other option. And I think January 6th demonstrates that. And the reason that elections are important is they stop disagreements from resulting in violence. They're an agreed upon procedure that we define in advance, that we're going to abide by the outcome, even if we don't like it. And there are rules. And whether the rules have been followed is something that has to be adjudicated by judges. And you can disagree with the judges, but agreeing with their decision is also part of the rules. And agreeing with their decision is part of what stops it from descending into violence. Elections are not about distilling some kind of mystical will of the people. And if you think that the true will of the people is not reflected in the election outcome, then it must be an unjust outcome. That's a collectivist point of view. There is no such thing as the true will of the people. And that's in spite of the fact that, yeah, maybe there's some people out there who might have voted a different way if they had heard something different about Hunter Biden's laptop. It's irrelevant. I mean, it's the same issue as what happened in the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, where Trump supporters today will say, well, what about that? The Democrats say that election was stolen. Well, they can be wrong too, again. And it's the same issue, that there were agreed upon procedures for deciding whether or not a ballot had sufficiently shown the intention of the voter, and past a certain point, whether there's a hanging chad or not, that doesn't qualify. And judges, courts have to be the ones to decide what's the procedure, what counts. It's not about discerning some hidden will or intention. It's about setting up rules that have to be followed, because the only alternative is violence. And now we see that happening. And that connects to, I think, the last and most concerning point about all of this, which is the way in which this pardon of January 6th protesters and attackers really now injects into our political system the implicit threat of force into future elections. Everybody knows about how between the election and January 6th, Trump made all kinds of calls to election officials trying to get them to find the votes that he needed to win, which is, I think, bad enough on its own. What I think people don't fully appreciate, something that they will learn about if they read the January 6th report by the House of Representatives. I read the whole thing, it's all 600 pages of it. And one of the things that comes out to me that's most striking to me is the way in which, when these election officials did not give Trump the things that he wanted, when the various state legislators did not convene joint sessions of the House and Senate to rewrite the election rules for the state, which electors would get sent to Washington, D.C. and so forth. When they didn't give him what he wanted, he would attack them. on social media. He would tell lies about them on social media and thereby channel the mob to harass and intimidate these election officials. It wasn't just what happened on January 6th. There was a whole Stop the Steal campaign directed against local state houses and local election officials leading up to it in those months. There were election officials regularly targeted for harassment and intimidation by Trump, sometimes directly by Trump, not just because of his lies about them. The women in the Georgia State Farm Arena who were baselessly accused of somehow stealing votes, their names, Trump publicized their names on social media. They were then constantly targeted with racist death threats. Trump tweeted the cell phone number of a Michigan Senate Majority Leader, Mike Shirkey, when he wouldn't go along with Trump's fake elector schemes. Then, of course, Shirkey is targeted by trolls and harassers. Many others faced harassment at their home. They faced death threats, etc., because of lies Trump told about the election. One Pennsylvania legislator, the Senate Majority Leader Kim Ward, said she couldn't come out against a fraudulent letter that her colleagues had signed because she would get her house bombed. January 6th is in the culmination of this. It's harassing the congressmen who are tasked with the final job of counting the votes. This is now an implicit threat of force hanging over every election official, every politician, that if one party doesn't like the election results, we'll send mobs to harass the officials who are tasked with counting these votes. And that is now something that's always going to hang over the head of every official who has to comply with his duty or not. Am I going to do my constitutional duty? Am I going to actually look at the facts? Or am I going to worry about intimidation and violence and having my house bombed? I think it's also indirectly a threat aimed at voters who don't want a repeat of 2020, who have to think, well, which side is more likely to riot if I don't vote for them? And that's why I think, Elan, you and Ankar Gate, our colleague, you did a episode the week of January 6th back in 2021. And one of the surprising things that you said was this was not a insurrection or a riot, or at least it was not simply an insurrection or a riot. There was no realistic plan anyone had of actually overthrowing the government because of that. I think that's right. What you said was this was a domestic terrorist attack. And I think, especially after having read the January 6th report, that is precisely correct. This was a domestic terrorist attack because it was political violence aimed at intimidating people politically, aimed at nudging election results in the future in the direction intended by those perpetrating the violence. It's inexcusable, it's outrageous, it's unjust, it's nihilistic, it's authoritarian, and it is a dagger at the heart of our constitutional order, which depends upon a strict separation of powers. Those powers cannot function if they are now threatened by intimidation of the mob. And that, I think, is a very grave concern.
I agree. I think we should draw a line there and recommend to people, if they were interested in the analysis we had on January 13th, a few days after the attack, once some of the findings were starting to surface, we did a podcast called Storming of the Capitol from 2021. We'll put that in the show notes. And another episode that we did in the midst of the hearings in June 15th, 2022, Ankar and I discussed what was happening. And I think for many people, it's useful to go back to that. I rewatched that one and to understand more about what the hearings were, some of the flaws in the hearings, some of the virtues of the hearings. It's not like the hearings were without their own deficiencies, but I think they did do essentially the job that was needed, which was to surface the facts and put them on the record, which I think is an important step in putting us on the track towards being concerned with facts and evidence and persuasion, which is sorely lacking. And as always, if you want to learn more about the work that we do, subscribe to this channel, you'll get more of our content. If you have comments or questions or feedback, we will read the comments that you post under this video. We encourage you to tell us what you think. You can also reach out to us by email, newideal@aynrand.org. We read everything that comes in. We try to respond to many of them, and some of them become episodes in the future. So we welcome your feedback and thoughts on today and other episodes. Until next time, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.